Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound Podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And today, the two of us are back here in the studio, just the two of us today. We've taken a little bit of a break from episodes recently. We've been rethinking how we want to provide valuable content and to have conversations that are interesting both to the both of us and also to you all who are listening. And so we've got a whole bunch of ideas planned that you should make sure to stay subscribed for. We're going to have some really interesting guests coming on soon, including some from our own staff. But for the time being, for the next couple of episodes, the two of us have both found some interesting resources that we thought were worth discussing here on an episode. And so we just want to go ahead and dive right into that. So, Jonathan, do you want to kind of give a little bit of an introduction to the thing that's piqued your curiosity recently?
Yeah, absolutely. And we might also add that we appreciate your patience and waiting for these episodes. It's not because we weren't interested in the Be Unbound podcast. It just so happened that we were consumed with a bunch of other things. And we also thought this is a good time to reset and rethink some of the ways we're going with the Be Unbound podcast. And I say that because it's a little bit of an introduction into what we're talking about. David and I found some articles that we thought were pretty interesting. I found one entitled The Illegal Engine Building. And this is on overlandprojects.com on their blogs. And it was a pretty fascinating article where the writer goes on and talks about building engines and then the inability to build engines in California right now because of regulations. So there's a lot here about regulations and what it does. And that's maybe a whole different subject. It might be a very interesting one. But I think the part that really caught my interest the most was that he laments the lack of curiosity and the ability to pursue that curiosity as it relates, in this case, to building engines. And then, David, you found an article that is on something entirely different and yet came to some interesting conclusions. So tell us about the article you found.
Yeah, so I found one on the Gospel Coalition that was written by Luke Simon, who was talking about his experience with getting over a very serious phone addiction, or as apparently the Oxford Press puts it, a victim of brain rot from being just overly using a cell phone. And the fact that he found his solace and thinks that it's a really interesting way to fight against the temptation to be overly addicted to smartphones is just by reading books, and some of the interesting implications that has both from a physical and physiological perspective, but also just from a cultural perspective of how books shape and inform our thinking.
So add to that, recently, maybe as recently as yesterday, I watched a short on YouTube. I wasn't reading a book, so that maybe there's something there. I watched a short on YouTube, and it was something like high school in 1989, which of course is ironic because I didn't go to high school in 1989 or any other year since I was homeschooled. But anyhow, so the whole thing was a window to a world that I didn't experience. But it was somebody run a video camera around high school halls in 1989. And I was not so much intrigued by the video. I was intrigued by what I'd find in the comments. And so I read through a bunch of them. And they were really poignant and also kind of pulling at the heart because without exception, I didn't find anything that wasn't sort of portraying this sort of sentiment. It was that kind of life is irreplaceably gone. And it's not possible to have that kind of a life anymore because everybody's concerned about what they look like. I think one of the comments was, how nice to see people walking around and not worrying about camera angles, which was intriguing. There was people there that were being authentic, that everybody was okay, was able to be themselves. Now, frankly, I kind of remember that there was never a time when public school allowed everybody to be themselves. I think that there's some cultural issues there.
That's just kind of a human reality, frankly.
Yeah, I think there's some nostalgia, rose-colored glasses looking back. But what I was struck by the most, David, out of these three pieces of media, so there's these two articles and this YouTube short, was this idea of inevitability. Now, your article, the one you referenced in the Gospel Coalition, the author there is encouraging people to read books. The article I read and the short that I watched were basically lamenting a time that was past, and they ended at the lament. In other words, they see this as something that is irrecoverable and irretrievable. And I was struck by that because I don't know. I do know that we don't live in 1989. As I was relating to David earlier, I said, I don't really want to live in 1989. I couldn't run Unbound in 1989. We could do the things that we're doing, right? And so I don't have nostalgia for it in that way. But I understand the poignancy there. But I just sort of reject this idea that we're powerless in this situation.
Yeah, there's always just this interesting tension of looking to I think that you can find this in pretty much any area of life, regardless of whether it's reading or in high school or just about any area of society where we're wanting to move forward and be able to have more capability to do more things. Like the fact that we have devices in our pockets that can bring us the wealth of the vast majority of the world's information just pretty much at an instant is amazing. And that is, I think, generally speaking, a good thing. But also, we just have to be very conscious of the fact that, okay, if we are moving towards adopting something that is beneficial, what are we potentially losing out on if we are putting more time, more resources to this new thing? What are we potentially going to be leaving behind? And so there's always just kind of this tension of, like, we want to be more capable. We want to move to new things. And I think that's even a call from God for us to explore his creation, to find what's possible, to be as he has equipped us to be. And yet at the same time, he calls us to constantly remember what we have been taught and to remember the lessons that we've already learned. And so I think that just more than ever, especially in the just such a huge information age that we're in right now, we're feeling that tension, especially now that we're getting more and more studies that are showing, hey, full on embracing the technological movement forward can have some really harmful side effects. And then there's some people who are starting to look the other way, who are starting to say, actually, if you just kind of put your phone down and just read some books, like not saying that, not trying to move back to 1989, but just trying to say, hey, if you spend less time on your phone and you spend more time reading books, you tend to feel better. And there's just some very simple observations that we're starting to make. And I think we're kind of starting to see some of the cultural recognition of the fact that, hey, just embracing the forward movement in and of itself can sometimes lead to some consequences that we're not entirely sure we want to deal with.
I think that brings up an interesting observation, a sort of set of thinking. One of the things that we've been talking about as we're looking at redesigning a little bit the Be Unbound podcast is that, what is the purpose? What we're trying to talk about here? And it's very much a reflection of what we have found in Unbound. And so in some ways, Unbound becomes this intriguing sort of laboratory for us to talk about some of these things on the podcast. And one of the things, through a variety of influences, Unbound has become very much focused on what I call the wisdom parts of the Bible. And you can interpret that a couple of different ways, but the way I've often explained to our students and even to parents that are involved in the program is to say, look, we're unapologetically Christian. We're informed by a Christian worldview. We try to be careful, though, not to talk about doctrine or really deep theology. It's not that we don't have really strong opinions about those things or even some strong learnings about those. It's just that we feel like that's very much a local church thing. But we do have a niche, a position where we can talk about the practical application of the truth of the Christian worldview and of our faith. And so that's kind of the wisdom. It's the Proverbs sections, right? It's the Ecclesiastes sections. It's the sections that sort of where the rubber hits the road and it gives advice and guidance and teaching that allow you to live your life in a more effective way. And in some ways, it's life as it ought to be, because of course we can't script life the way we want it to be. I mean, so so we're projecting live this way as well as much as it's capable of you. And then the outcomes are generally favorable, not always. And then you also should be prepared for the not always part. And so there's a practical seam to this. And so as we talk about this, I think there's a couple ways. The people that write these articles, and many thanks to them, they're writing them at a sort of a higher cerebral level. There's an idea that they're presenting here, which is fantastic. We're talking about their ideas, so that's great, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I'd like to do is I'd like to think about what are the implications of that idea. And David, some of the things that you're saying there is that, there's these two pieces. But I think that there's a point there that we should note. I don't think most people are equipped and able to utter that statement. And it's not because they're ignorant or they're less smart than us or anything like that. We're not implying that at all. It's that part of the reason, David, I think you say that, and I think the same thing, is because of some understanding of a Christian worldview. Because you said something really interesting there. You said God created us to move forward. We did. And he also caused us to sort of pause, remember, and to think. And there's an aspect here of our belief in God says, hey, we're interested in new things and moving forward in progress. Our belief in God also causes us to question where that progress is going, because ultimately we don't have to be led by the nose, by the technology, wherever it's going. we're going someplace else and we have a really strong sense of identity and purpose about where we're going. And then that becomes this interesting filter to say, is the technology taking me there or not? And if not, I can choose to not ride this train. I think that is where those ideas interact with some practicality. What I was struck by the article and the video that I watched was the inevitability. People sort of stating, there's no return to this. There's no defense against this. I must go where I'm led. I think that's wild for a consumer device. Ultimately, we are choosing to pay for this thing. And so that's kind of an interesting twist on it that I'm always a little brought up short by when people say, well, kids must have a phone. Kids are going to do this. Students are going to do this. People are going to do this. There's a level of choice involved in here that we sometimes forget about.
Yeah. Well, I think most likely most of the listeners to this podcast are at least a fan of or are already in the process of homeschooling their kids. And so there's already a sense of, and the fact that homeschooling has drastically increased over the last, especially 5 years, especially since COVID and since there's been a lot of turmoil in the educational space, people are starting to realize, wait a minute, just because this is the way that most of what is seen as the way forward is going, like, we don't necessarily have to do that. Let's think through, is what is generally accepted as the way forward, is that beneficial or not? There's I think it's worth noting here. Sometimes, generally speaking, like sometimes there are directives in things that can happen where, yes, it is better to just go with what the general idea is that is moving forward. For example, I think the innovation of automobiles and as just a general adoption was rough at first, but in general was a really helpful thing, and was a helpful thing for most people to go along with. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't just look at some of these innovations and look at some of the momentum that we have going and just pause for a second and think, okay, but why? I think there's very rarely a circumstance where it's a bad idea to stop and say, okay, let me make sure that I know why we're doing this before we just say, yeah, sounds good, let's go for it.
Well, and that pause, I think, is one of the advantages here of, if you can pause and recalibrate. If you're on a hike and you're just wandering and you don't care where you go, you just walk, and then you'll find out that you're seriously lost. I mean, and you would say, well, I didn't have any other option. I just kind of walked. But that's different if you're going someplace. If you know that you're supposed to arrive someplace, then you pause, sometimes frequently, depending on the terrain, and you check your compass, you check your map, you check where you are, you figure out location, you do some calculation in terms of how far you've come and how far you think you're going. Maybe you measure your supplies and your water sources and all those things. In other words, having a destination changes everything. It allows you to stay in context. And that's a part that I think is very much missing. I observe that there's a lot of people who are living lives out of context. They don't have anything. They don't have a destination clearly in mind. They don't have a set of circumstances that are giving them some guardrails and guidelines. And so they're just sort of drifting. And then they wind up and they say, well, it's inevitable that I ended up here because this is just the next thing. And I think we underestimate how much, even on a small micro scale that turns out to have macro implications, having this idea of a faith, I'm going someplace, I have an obedience to an allegiance to a set of ideas and ideals and to an understanding of reality. And that destination then flows down into everything. And so when something comes along, like, will I buy this new phone or not? Will I spend all my time on it? Will I do all these things? That has to be measured against something else. And often in that measuring, it's going to come up and you're going to say, well, no, that's not exactly what I was going to do. That's not what I need to do. That's not what I think is important. I'm going to make a different decision.
Another thing that I think, to add on to that mindset that you're talking about, is I think I observe a lot that it's very easy for people to kind of get trapped in a sunk cost fallacy with just their life experiences in general and think, well, because everything in my life has led up to this point, therefore I just need to make this decision that flows out of that, because why would I try to change the course of life at this point? Why would I try to redirect the course? Why would I try to shove the rolling boulder to the side? I'm just going to get crushed. That's sort of the attitude that's had there. And For one thing, that's just an attitude that just demonstrates a stark lack of hope that our culture suffers from so dramatically, which I think can be linked to a lot of the social issues that we see in our world today. But it also just points to how valuable it is once you're able to finally say, you know what, I don't want to continue on this path just because it seems like the inevitable one. And maybe it doesn't look like just planting yourself directly in front of the boulder and trying to stop it all at once. Maybe it just means giving it a shove to the side every once in a while. Or maybe it just means like putting a couple of like other rocks or like tree branches in front of it just to start it slowing down or moving it in a different direction. I think because a lot of the time we find ourselves in situations where it seems like there's so much that's pushing us in one direction that considering an alternative feels completely paralyzing. And so it just takes a lot of careful consideration to say, you know what, actually, as overwhelming as this feels, there is another direction that we can go. And maybe it's harder. A lot of the time, probably is, but might just be worth it. And it's worth considering what it could take to get there and what I could stand to gain if I do.
Well, I think there's a lot of excitement that comes in there. I think there's a lot of, the power of being able to say no, the power of saying, let's do this differently, I think is very underappreciated. And I think that, people often say, well, it's going to be hard. Maybe, yes, I guess. It depends a little bit on your definition of hard. It also can be invigorating when you realize that, you have control. I get this a lot, David, and talk to parents, and parents will inevitably present to me technological addictions as a fact of life. And I'm not in any way downplaying the fact that this is a problem and it can be quite challenging. But there is also a reality that it is not mandated. There is no law. You are not compelled to provide technological devices to your children. And I say that sort of half jokingly and half not. If you're listening to this, just hear me clearly. It is not necessary. It's not even responsible and reasonable to provide technological devices to your children. In fact, there's a growing body of evidence that it's quite dangerous. But I know this from personal experience. I feel no compelling need to provide my 3-year-old and 1-year-old with any kind of electronic devices. In fact, I feel a compelling need to not do that. But for that matter, I feel no need and responsibility whatsoever to buy a cell phone or electronic device for my 15-year-old. We provide some access to computers and laptops because we take advantage of some educational pieces. But there's absolutely zero need for a phone. And that's not something that I feel the least bit of pressure to provide. And in doing so, I'm opening up a whole new world of opportunity for them. But I'm also accepting the fact that this is my responsibility. And I can choose to do something different. And we've alluded to this before, but, David and I live not too far away from an old order Mennonite community. And so, anytime somebody says, well, I have to, I think, there's a sizable portion of the population, it's not inconsequential, here and in other states, who make a living, live, die, participate in community, have meaningful lives, and they've opted out of most of the things that we talk about and think is necessary, including what David referred to earlier in terms of automobiles, right? Now, I am not in any way, shape, or form advocating that we become Amish or Mennonite or that we should give up automobiles and drive a horse and buggy. I simply take that as some level of inspiration to say that, at the extreme end, there are people demonstrating that is not only possible, but it can be a situation where people thrive. And then that kind of challenges me to go, okay, what is it that I'm relying on that I don't really need? And what things that maybe have me entrapped that I don't need to be entrapped by? And what decisions can I make to look at this and do things differently? And to me, that's where there's a grand amount of excitement here. This is not one more piece of content telling you not to look at your phone. Instead, I'd like to say, hey, this is a piece of content reminding you that from a Christian worldview, if you're following something, it gives you context to be able to make sense of the choices in front of you. And that sometimes what makes sense in those choices in front of you is to say, I'm going to opt out of that. And that may be opt out entirely, or it may be opt out in some different ways, or it might be a limiting thing. And that is possible. It just takes not grand amounts of willpower, not superhuman strength. It just takes the ability to stop and go, I don't have to do that.
Yeah.
And see where that leads you.
And I think it's also worth noting too here that it looks different for different people
100%.
too. Like different people are going to find different balances that work for them. In the case of the young man who wrote the Gospel Coalition article that I was alluding to earlier. He had to completely take a break from all electronic devices for about a year, but then he was able to slowly integrate them back in, and now he's found a good balance. And the reality is that I've found a balance that's probably looks different than the balance that he's found. And the balance that you may find for your life may be different than mine. And I think that's been just a challenge that has been a reality for Christians for pretty much the entire time that we've been in existence. And that's ranged from anything from, as Jonathan alluded to earlier, alcohol all the way to electronic devices today. And I don't think that unless there is something clearly stated in scripture that says do this and don't do this, scripture actually leaves us a lot of room to be able to say, hey, I'm going to use the wisdom that God's given me to figure out what is the best way that I can live my life to build the kingdom of God and glorify Him, serve others who I have relationships with. What's going to be the best way to live my life to do that? And maybe that means a couple hours a day looking at screens. Maybe it means no hours a day looking at screens. Whatever that looks like, ultimately, if that's the focus, as long as that is the focus, then there's actually a lot of freedom in how you can go about things. And I think, as you were alluding to, there's a lot of content that's just saying, yeah, screens are terrible, do nothing with them. And there's a lot of pull to use screens more and more. I think it's just encouraging to hear, you know what? It might not look like either. Figure it out. God's got you either way, and you can build His kingdom no matter what you do, as long as that's what you're looking to do.
Well, one last lesson from the Amish and Mennonite neighbors that we have, and that is that people sometimes misunderstand this. The Amish and Mennonite do not choose to drive a horse and buggy and not drive cars because they think the Bible mandates it. That they are not making any argument that there's some sort of biblical command to only drive horse and buggies. Instead, they look at this a little differently. They do think there's a biblical command to live together in community. And their question they constantly ask is, will this piece of technology enhance our community? And the reason they run horse and buggies is that they say, if we have cars, then we will no longer be physically connected as a community because the car enables us to travel great distances and we will spread out geographically. And as we spread out geographically, our ability to be interacting with one another face to face and rely on one will decrease. And so therefore, the horse and buggy is not some biblically mandated, ban on technology. The horse and buggy is actually a tool to ensure that our communities remain in physical touch with one another, because there's only so far you can go on a horse and buggy before it becomes impractical. And so therefore, we will have to live in the same geographical proximity, and we'll rely on each other, and we will see each other, and we'll fellowship with each other. We will build deep communities. Well, you would have to grant that in most cases, that's very successful. And I find that to be a really exciting, interesting way to look at things. And so that might be the question we'd like to leave you with, which is from a practical standpoint, as you think about your relationship to Christ and His church and building His kingdom and the mission He's given you, what are the things that you think that are important for you to prioritize? And when I say you think, I mean not you just making that decision, but you comparing that against the calling that you have. And then how might you assess the things in your life and ask that question? Is this enabling me in that mission, or is it disabling me in that mission? And I think, to David's point, there's a great amount of freedom in that. It does not mean that you have to give up cars, but it may mean that you have to adjust or rearrange the ways that you use the tools that are available to you, or it may mean that you're just deliberate about how you use them. You might be in good shape, and this is a good guideline to keep you there. So as we end this episode and we turn to talking to you a little bit about Unbound, there's kind of an interesting segue here, because one of the reasons we've been pausing this podcast is we were preparing for an event that we ran in January called Ridgeline. We will have a wrap-up video coming out a little bit after we release this episode, and so we're looking forward to that. But in short terms, Ridgeline was where we asked all of our students at our previous event to come up with a bunch of ideas for projects that they could do in 3 days. And we gave them some parameters in terms of how much they're challenged with that and all those kinds of things. Then we allowed everybody to vote on it. We went through a discernment process, and we ended up greenlighting 9 of those projects out of the 100 or so that our students submitted. And when I say greenlighted, we basically told students, yes, you can do this. And we provided some coaching and some assistance, but not much else. And those projects ranged in scope from writing, acting in, filming, editing, and producing a short film, to writing and producing an original piece of music that they then turned into a music video, to a group that built an escape room that could be portable and taken to different events, to one group who bought a car that was not running in hopes of repairing it and giving it away to somebody in need, to a group that wanted to build and learn to sail a sailboat. And then those are just a sampling of the kinds of things that happened while we were there. And what was exciting to me was that if you wonder, in this article that I read about, it's illegal engine building and there was bemoaning a lack of curiosity. Well, I can tell you that I had a bunch of students who were curious about whether they could build and learn to sail a sailboat in 3 days. And I will tell you honestly, I was intensely curious about that as well and wondered how that was going to come about. There was a group of students who were curious whether they could procure and buy a vehicle for less than $2,500 that was not running, and then in a parking lot at a camp that we'd never been to before, be able to repair it and put it into some sort of workable situation that they could then feel good and would be ethical to give it to somebody.
And to be honest, for the first day or so of that project, that was a little bit in question.
That was a lot bit in question, and I was intensely curious about that as well. And so the short answer, and you have to say the wrap-up video to see all the details, is that the answer is yes, they were able to do those things. And it was an incredible experience, but it was also a reminder to what we're talking about here, with some incentive, a little bit of time pressure, some creativity, and some space to just dream up some stuff. It's not like the people that are living now are radically different from those in 1989 or before. Humans are still humans at base. They're still capable of incredible things. And when you have access to the internet and lots of information, some of those things are even more incredible than they would have been otherwise. And so let's note that our group did build a sailboat from scratch and did take it out and sail it. But let's also note that they found the plans for that sailboat online, and they collaborated on getting the materials that they needed through technology to then come together and in 3 days take a pile of plywood that they bought from the local Home Depot and literally turned it into a boat that they sailed across the lake in Florida. And so I just found that to be encouraging. It's exciting. I think we're still all buzzed and jazzed from that kind of event. We're still excited about what happened there. I'm still kind of racing on it. I'm both half terrified and half excited to see what next year's Ridgeline will look like. And if that sounds all intriguing to you, you can learn more at beunbound.us, or you can search for the Be Unbound podcast on YouTube, or perhaps you're watching this here and you can find it and get our wrap-up videos. But that's all part of our Ascend program. And Ascend is our post-high school flagship program. And we want to highlight that to you because of Ridgeline, and also as a reminder that we're coming into the intense part of recruiting season. We have over half of the slots in our class already filled. And so there's becoming a point where we're going to have limited spaces available as we come out to the rest of the spring. And if you're interested in this program at all, you should go to beunbound.us and you should schedule an appointment with our admissions team and be able to learn more. We also just did a couple webinars here recently, and you can access those and find out some more information through that. But you really ought to talk to us if this is interesting to you. And you probably should do it sooner than later with the way our year has been going. So we encourage you to do that. We thank you so much for your time. We're excited to be back behind the microphones and looking forward to the schedule that we have ahead of us. And until next time, which won't be too far away, be unbound.